In the town of Millbrook Falls, tucked between two slow rivers in upstate New York, there was a shop with a bell above the door that had rung the same note for 52 years. The sign above the window read simply, Thornwood Watch Repair. Inside, a man named Ezra Thornwood spent his days bent over a fault-lined workbench, a loop screwed into his eye socket, coaxing dead watches back to life one gear at a time. Ezra died on a Tuesday in November, at the age of 81, sitting in the same chair he had sat in nearly every day of his adult life. The coroner said his heart simply stopped, the way an old clock stops when its mainspring finally gives out. The town mourned him the way small towns mourn their quiet fixtures. Nobody in Millbrook Falls expected what came next. 3 weeks after the funeral, a lawyer from Albany arrived at the town hall carrying a single manila folder. Inside was Ezra Thornwood's last will and testament, and a bank statement that made the town clerk set down her coffee cup so hard it cracked the saucer. The account, held quietly for decades under a modest brokerage name, was worth $3,340,000. The man who had charged $12 to replace a watch battery, who had patched the elbows of his own coat rather than buy a new one, had died a millionaire many times over, and almost nobody had known. The mayor of Millbrook Falls, a woman named Carol Epson, who had brought Ezra her father's pocket watch every spring for cleaning, later admitted she assumed the lawyer had the wrong file. Ezra Thornwood, she said, was a man who once haggled with her over the price of a new watch crystal for nearly 10 minutes before settling on splitting the difference. It seemed impossible that the same man had quietly amassed a fortune that could have bought half the storefronts on Main Street. To understand how, you have to go back to 1968, the year a 19-year-old Ezra took over his father's failing watch shop after a fire damaged half the storefront. His father had never trusted banks, let alone the stock market. He had lived through the Depression as a boy and carried that fear his entire life, keeping cash in coffee tins beneath the floorboards rather than risk it anywhere else. When a fire swept through the back half of the storefront, in the winter of 1967, most of those coffee tins were never recovered from the wreckage, and what little remained was barely enough to cover his father's funeral 2 years later. Ezra swore, standing in the ashes of the workshop, where he had learned his trade, that he would not repeat his father's mistake. For years afterward, though, he had no real idea what the alternative even was. Nobody in his circle discussed investing. It was not a subject taught in trade school, and the men he knew treated the stock market the way they treated horse racing, a game for the reckless or the already rich. The answer came from an unlikely source. A retired school teacher named Mrs. Iris Halloway brought in a broken pocket watch one autumn afternoon in 1971. While Ezra worked, she talked about her late husband, a modest accountant who had spent 30 years quietly buying shares in a broad stock market index fund. He never chased hot stocks. He never tried to time the market. He simply bought a little every month, reinvested every dividend, and ignored the noise. When he passed, Mrs. Halloway discovered he had left her comfortable beyond anything their modest income ever suggested. She told Ezra one sentence he never forgot: the market rewards patience, not cleverness. That week, Ezra opened his first brokerage account with $1,100, most of his savings. He arranged for $25 to be automatically invested every single week into a low-cost index fund tracking the broader market. It was not a fortune. It was barely noticeable against the cost of running a small shop. But Ezra treated that weekly investment the way he treated a customer's appointment, something you simply did not miss. The 1970s tested him early. Inflation soared into double digits. Gas lines wrapped around the block. The market slid for years without much relief, and more than one customer told him he was throwing his money away on something that would never recover. Ezra kept sending his $25 anyway, week after week, through years when the account barely seemed to move at all. In 1987, on the day the market lost nearly a quarter of its value in a single afternoon, panic swept through Millbrook Falls like a fever. Television sets in the diner showed men on trading floors shouting and waving papers, and by evening, half the town had heard some version of the news. A regular customer, a hardware store owner named Pete Vance, rushed into the shop pale and shaking, asking if Ezra had heard what happened. Ezra had heard. He nodded, finished setting the balance wheel on the watch in front of him without looking up, and told Pete that watches don't run backward just because someone drops them on the floor. Neither did he plan to. His weekly deposit went through as scheduled that Friday, same as every Friday before it. While Pete spent the weekend on the phone with his broker, trying to sell everything he owned. By the early 1990s, Ezra had increased his contribution to $50 a week as the shop's business grew steadier. He never spoke of money. He drove the same pickup truck for 18 years, wore his father's old wool coat through a dozen winters, and ate lunch most days from a tin pail he packed himself. Anyone glancing through the shop window would have seen a modest tradesman, not a man quietly compounding his way toward a fortune. The dot-com boom of the late 1990s brought a different kind of pressure. Customers bragged about doubling their money on technology stocks nobody had heard of a year earlier. A few urged Ezra to move his savings into these exciting new companies. He declined, politely, and kept buying his same broad index fund every week without exception. When the bubble burst in 2000, wiping out fortunes built on speculation, Ezra's steady approach looked almost boring by comparison. Boring, it turned out, was exactly the point. He took on an apprentice in 2003, a quiet teenager named Miguel Reyes, who showed an unusual gift for delicate mechanical work. Ezra told him everything about watches, but he also passed along something else. Every payday, he made Miguel set aside a small portion, no matter how little, into an investment account of his own. Consistency, Ezra told him, mattered far more than the size of any single contribution, and the account balance in the early years would look almost embarrassingly small, so small it hardly seemed worth checking. Miguel didn't fully understand it then, and there were months he skipped his own contribution to cover rent or a car repair, quietly hoping Ezra wouldn't notice. He would understand the full weight of the lesson only decades later. The 2008 financial crisis arrived like a winter storm nobody had forecast, one that began quietly with a handful of failed mortgage companies and grew, within a year, into the worst collapse most of the town had ever witnessed. The market fell nearly in half over 18 brutal months. Neighbors who had refinanced their homes against rising property values watched those values evaporate. Ezra watched his own account balance, which had grown to nearly $600,000 by then, shrink toward $300,000 almost overnight, a number that would have frightened most men his age into selling everything and hiding the rest in a mattress. Miguel, then a young man barely out of his apprenticeship, sat across from Ezra one evening with a newspaper spread between them, terrified, and asked if they should sell everything and wait for calmer days to come back in. Ezra shook his head slowly and said that selling in a storm was how people turned a temporary loss into a permanent one, that the ship doesn't sink just because the deck is wet. He kept his automatic deposits running without missing a single week. When the market began its long, grinding recovery in the years that followed, Ezra's steady buying straight through the worst of the crash meant he had quietly purchased enormous quantities of shares at their lowest prices in a generation. Shares that would go on to multiply many times over in the decade that followed. By 2015, Ezra was investing $300 a week, still living in the small apartment above his shop, still repairing watches for whoever walked through the door. Younger customers sometimes teased him about his old truck or his unfashionable coat, not realizing the coat's owner was worth more than most of the wealthy families on the north side of town combined. Ezra never corrected them. He found a strange comfort in being underestimated. When the pandemic struck in 2020 and markets convulsed violently in a matter of weeks, Ezra was 75 years old and had seen this pattern 4 times before. He didn't flinch. His weekly investment continued exactly as scheduled while younger, wealthier neighbors panicked and sold at the bottom. By the time he closed his shop for good in early autumn of that year, quietly retiring, Ezra spent his final years much as he had spent every year before them, fixing the occasional watch for old friends, tending a small vegetable garden behind his apartment, and having Sunday dinner with Miguel, who had opened his own repair shop 2 towns over and credited Ezra for every dollar of security he now had. Ezra never remarried after losing his young fiancée decades earlier in a car accident, never had children of his own, and lived so modestly that his neighbors assumed he survived on his small pension and whatever the shop still brought in. But never quite stopping his tinkering, his account had crossed $2 million. His will left the bulk of his fortune to Miguel, with instructions to use a portion of it to establish a scholarship fund for young people in Millbrook Falls interested in learning a skilled trade. A smaller sum went to the town library, with a note asking only that they keep the reading lamps well maintained, since he had spent so many winter evenings there as a boy. The rest he directed toward the volunteer fire department that had once saved what remained of his father's shop. At the reading of the will, Miguel finally understood the lesson Ezra had been teaching him with every paycheck for 17 years. A lesson he had absorbed so gradually he never noticed it becoming part of him. It was never really about watches or discipline or even money itself. It was about time and what patience could quietly build inside it if you simply refused to interrupt it. Ezra had never once tried to predict where the market was headed next, never once claimed to know something the professionals didn't. He had simply shown up week after week, decade after decade, and let 5 decades of ordinary Tuesdays do something extraordinary. Somewhere in a drawer of the old shop, among spare gears and loose crystal faces, sat a single index card in Ezra's careful handwriting, the kind of steady penmanship that comes from a lifetime of delicate work. It read, "The market does not reward the loudest voice in the room. It rewards the one still buying when everyone else has stopped listening." Miguel had the card framed and hung it above his own workbench, where it remains today, a small reminder passed from one quiet tradesman to another. Millbrook Falls eventually renamed a small reading room at the library in his honor, a modest plaque above the door reading, "Simply for Ezra Thornwood, who understood that time, like a watch, only works if you leave